This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. In December, President Obama told some of the nation's top bankers that they need to explore every responsible way to make more loans. The president said, America's banks received extraordinary assistance from American taxpayers to rebuild their industry. And now that they're back on their feet, we expect extraordinary commitment from them to help rebuild the economy. Major banks have been doing well since the worst of the financial crisis shook Wall Street more than a year ago. Banks including Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo have recently announced plans to repay government rescue money. New profits and freedom from the pay limits tied to federal aid mean bankers can again receive big bonuses. But critics say banks are profiting mainly from trading activities, not from making loans to small businesses or homeowners. Britain has placed a 50% tax on bonuses for bankers. There have been calls for similar measures in the United States. Unemployment rates are the highest in a generation, 10% nationally in November. An estimated 17% of the labor force either lacks a job or is not working enough to pay all the bills. The weak job market has not only hurt spending, it also puts pressure on homeowners who are struggling to pay their mortgage loans. Record numbers have been told that they could lose their homes. Banks are expected to have sent almost 4 million foreclosure notices in 2009. The administration has had limited success with its promise of $75 billion to help struggling homeowners. The Making Home Affordable program aims to prevent up to 4 million foreclosures. The idea is to get banks to reduce monthly payments, but fewer than 32,000 loans have been permanently changed so far. Lenders are unwilling to change loans that they suspect will fail anyway. An estimated 1/4 of homeowners owe more than their home is worth. That situation increases the risk that a loan will not be repaid. Experts say progress in the housing market will be limited until the job market gets better. Most new jobs in the United States are created by small businesses. But small businesses have been hit hard by the recession and now the difficulty in getting loans. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. The United States government says Apple and 5 book publishers illegally fixed prices of ebooks. 3 publishers, Hachette, HarperCollins, and Simon & Schuster, agreed to a settlement announced April 11th with the Justice Department. The agreement says they must repay millions of dollars and stop giving Apple special treatment. Attorney General Eric Holder said the department will continue to take legal action against Apple and 2 additional leading publishers, Macmillan and Penguin. He says Apple and the publishers conspired to increase the prices that consumers pay for ebooks. He said the Justice Department wants to make sure Americans can buy ebooks at a fair price. The department says Apple and the 5 publishers made an illegal deal to set higher prices for electronic books. Because of this, it says, Americans paid millions of dollars more than they should have. The dispute centers on the influence of Amazon.com. The internet store had been selling ebooks for $9.99. But the government says Apple made a deal with the publishers 2 years ago as it prepared to launch the iPad tablet computer. The deal guaranteed Apple 30% of the money earned on each ebook sold. It also created a pricing model that required stores to sell at a price set by the publishers and Apple. The price was several dollars higher than the one offered by Amazon. Acting Assistant Attorney General Sheris Posen said, when companies get together and conspire to enter into agreements that eliminate price competition, it crosses the line. This kind of agreement is illegal and anti-competitive, she said. She added that company officials, including former Apple chief Steve Jobs, knew what they were doing at the time. The Justice Department case involves antitrust laws, which aim to halt business methods that crush competition. 16 states and Puerto Rico are also bringing their own case. Apple and British publishers Macmillan and Penguin have decided to go to court rather than settle with the Justice Department. Apple says the accusation made against it in the department's lawsuit on April 11th is simply not true. It says the launch of the iBookstore in 2010 supported competition and broke what it called Amazon's monopolistic grip on the publishing industry. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. For more business news and other stories for people learning English, go to voaspecialenglish.com. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. In late November, an American congressional committee failed to agree how to cut the federal budget deficit by $1.2 trillion over 10 years. The co-chairs of the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction said, "We have come to the conclusion today that it will not be possible to make any bipartisan agreement available to the public before the committee's deadline." The 12-member committee was created under the Budget Control Act of 2011. The group was equally divided between Democrats and Republicans. The goal was to find acceptable ways to cut federal deficits. Now, without an agreement, that will fall to involuntary cuts through the act of sequestration. The budgetary terms sequester and sequestration mean that the Treasury Department will withhold or cancel a set amount of spending. By law, equal cuts in both civilian and military spending will begin in 2013. A total of $1.2 trillion needs to be cut. This is in addition to cuts of about $900 billion required by the budget law that created the Congressional Supercommittee. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta has warned the combination of cuts could hurt his department. If the sequester goes into effect and it doubles the number of cuts, then it will truly devastate our national defense. This has made some lawmakers feel uneasy. Representative Howard McKeon of California opposes new cuts in military spending. National defense has contributed enough to deficit reduction. Many lawmakers are concerned that with elections next year, programs important to voters in their areas will be cut. That would add to increasing voter anger over what they consider a lack of action by lawmakers. President Obama has warned Congress that he will block any efforts to cancel the spending cuts. Already, some in Congress are trying to undo these automatic spending cuts. My message is simple. No, I will veto any effort to get rid of those automatic spending cuts. Experts say that Congress and the Obama administration could still reach agreement on budget cuts and taxes before the sequestration takes effect. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. Special English is VOA's daily source of news and information for people learning English. You can read, listen, and learn with texts, MP3s, and podcasts at voaspecialenglish.com. You can also get English lessons 3 times a day, Monday through Friday, at the VOA Learning English page on Facebook.
I'm Mario Ritter with the VOA Special English Economics Report. Today we continue our report on the group of chemical elements known as rare earth metals. These are mined from the earth and used to make technology, from mobile phones to missiles. The United States once led the world in rare earths. Today, China controls almost all production. Premier Wen Jiabao says China will not use these metals as a diplomatic weapon. But Japan says exports meant for that country have remained at Chinese ports as a result of a recent dispute. The United States stopped mining rare earths in 2002. Companies blamed environmental rules and low-priced imports from China. But now, exploration is moving forward again. Edward Cowell is president and chief executive of a company called U.S. Rare Earths. He and his partners gained rights to some land in the American West about 15 years ago. They had been interested in thorium, a radioactive element that can fuel nuclear reactors, but not be processed into weapons. Mr. Cowell later found that the land also held a lot of rare earth metals, lately a subject of intense interest. The company has not started mining yet. It still has to get permits and work with other businesses to put operations in place. Ed Cowell says a lot of work remains. He says the earliest that they could open the mine would be in 6 to 7 years. Another American company is Corp. Jim Sims, the public affairs director, says Corp has already begun producing 3,000 tons of rare earths a year. That makes the United States the world's second largest producer, a distant second. Mr. Sims says Corp is the Western Hemisphere's only producer of rare earth products. The company says the largest reserves of rare earths outside of China are in its mine in Mountain Pass, California, and in the Mount Weld area of Australia. Jim Sims says Moly Corp spends only about 10% on mining. The big cost is in chemically separating the rare earths from the minerals that carry them. He says Moly Corp raised about $380 million when it sold stock to the public for the first time in July. The company aims to increase production to 20,000 tons by 2012. It says that would more than meet current levels of demand in the United States. For VOA Special English, I'm Mario Ritter.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. The United States Postal Service has reported a loss of over $5 billion from April to June. The Postal Service says it expects to report a loss of $15 billion for the 12-month period ending in September. And it has warned of even bigger losses if Congress does not let mail service change the way it does business. The United States Postal Service, or USPS, has a history as long as the nation's own. Benjamin Franklin was appointed the first Postmaster General, or head of the Postal Service, in 1775. But the Postal Service says its income has not kept up with growing costs. For example, profitable first-class mail is decreasing. The service says most of its recent losses resulted from making payments to its health care program for retirees. About $1 billion of the loss was for payments to injured workers. The news from April to June was not all bad. Improvements in the economy fueled income growth of 9% from shipping and delivery. The Postal Service says it is less costly to send letters and packages in the mail than to use private companies. The USPS says it has cut operating costs by a total of $14 billion in the past 5 years. To improve its financial health, the agency has proposed cutting service on Saturdays. It wants Congress to cancel a requirement that the Postal Service make payments to its health care program for retired workers. USPS also wants the Treasury Department to return $11 billion in payments made to its pension plan for retirees. On August 1st, USPS failed to make a required payment of $5.5 billion for health care benefits for future retirees. It was the first time the Postal Service has ever failed to make such a payment. And the service is warning that it may have to delay making payments to companies to which it owes money. The Postal Service says that without major changes, it will continue to lose billions of dollars a year. The Washington Post newspaper reported that Postmaster General Patrick Donahoe told reporters, Congress needs to act responsibly. In his words, this is no way to run any kind of business. The Postal Service receives income for its operations from the sale of stamps, products, and shipping services. It does not receive direct government assistance, but is controlled by the federal government. For VOA Learning English, I'm Laurel Bowman.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. The United States Postal Service has a history as long as the nation's. The Second Continental Congress appointed Benjamin Franklin as the first Postmaster General in 1775. In September, the current Postmaster General, Patrick Donahue, brought an urgent message to a Senate committee. He told the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs that the post office could need more money by the end of the month. Without the enactment of comprehensive legislation by September 30th, the Postal Service will default on a mandated $5.5 billion payment to the Treasury to pre-fund retiree health benefits. Our situation is urgent. The Postal Service had losses of almost $6 billion for the 9-month period ending in June. That could grow to $10 billion for the year. Part of the deficit is a $5.5 billion payment to the Federal Retirement Plan for postal workers. Mr. Donahue is asking Congress to approve huge changes to the Postal Service. He wants to cut over 100,000 workers, close thousands of post offices, and end Saturday mail delivery. He says the service needs to operate more like a business. The Postal Service is responsible for its own financing and not part of the federal budget. But it does take part in federal retirement and health plans. It says it has paid too much to federal retirement plans and wants at least $7 billion returned. Mr. Donahue also wants to pull the Postal Service out of the federal benefit plans. He says the service's proposals could cut $20 billion by 2015 and return it to profitability. John Barry is director of the Federal Office of Personnel Management, which supervises federal retirement and health plans. He said the Obama administration would soon announce its own plan. At the hearing, Senator Susan Collins criticized the administration for not having a plan already. Leaders of 2 labor unions representing postal workers have also criticized the proposed cuts. The United States Postal Service has over 560,000 employees. It reported revenue of $67 billion last year, more than either of its biggest private competitors, FedEx or UPS. But as the amount of physical mail decreases, so too have the earnings from Postal Service operations. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Early estimates show that the United States economy began to grow again in July, August, and September. The 3.5% growth was the first expansion in more than a year and the strongest in 2 years. The government said increases in consumer spending and exports and improvements in business investment led the growth. So did increased federal spending and housing investments. But high unemployment could limit growth for some time. President Obama had this reaction to a report at the end of October on the gross domestic product, a wide measure of goods and services in the economy. Mr. Obama said, This is obviously welcome news and an affirmation that this recession is abating, and the steps we've taken have made a difference. But I also know that we've got a long way to go to fully restore our economy and recover from what's been the longest and deepest downturn since the Great Depression. That downturn was partly caused by bankers and others taking irresponsible risks to earn huge payments. So say their critics. Criticism of Wall Street pay is nothing new, but never before has the government used hundreds of billions of dollars to rescue companies that made risky investments. In June, the Obama administration appointed lawyer Kenneth Feinberg as the Special Master on Executive Pay, also known as the Pay Czar. Congress gave him power over compensation of the 25 highest paid employees at 7 companies most indebted to taxpayers. At the end of October, he gave lawmakers a progress report. He said he has reduced the amount of money available to these top officials by about 90%. The 7 companies are in the financial and auto industries. Now, Kenneth Feinberg must consider their next 75 highest paid officials. But some management experts warn that limiting pay could make it harder for taxpayers to get their money back. Edward Lawler at the University of Southern California says these companies may now have difficulty getting and keeping high-quality employees. But he agrees that in recent years, many companies have tied pay to short-term performance instead of their long-term health. He also says boards of directors need to do more to control pay. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report.
From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report. American wine producers are hoping to increase their sales in China, where the country's growing middle class is drinking wine. The United States exported just $74 million in wine to China last year, but exports are growing at a rate of nearly 20% a year. 2 years ago, former basketball star Yao Ming launched a wine company called Yao Family Wines. It is based in California's Napa Valley, one of the top wine-producing areas in the world. Tom Hind is with Yao Family Wines. He says the vineyard grows only Cabernet Sauvignon grapes because many people in China like red wine. The small winery makes a costly product. Its top Cabernet sells for $625 a bottle. Napa Valley's Black Stallion Winery also looks to China as a promising market. Holly Evans works for the company. She says the company has 2 wines that are sold throughout the United States and also in China. Many moderately priced wines are exported to China. They include some from the San Antonio Winery in Los Angeles. 15% of its production goes to China. The Wine Institute represents more than 1,000 wineries and allied businesses through California. Spokesperson Lindsay Gallagher says her group is always receiving requests from China. But she says the country is a problem for marketing. She says that in China, it is not known that California is the fourth largest wine-producing area in the world, producing many kinds of wine. Winemakers hope to expand the market for fine, dry wines, including white wines, which are now a small part of the Chinese market. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. American Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner recently urged China to let the exchange value of its money rise. Mr. Geithner was among top officials from both countries who gathered in Beijing for the U.S.-China Strategic Dialogue. Their goal was to increase cooperation on security and economic issues. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton spoke as the meeting opened on May 3rd. She said the two sides were working to build a relationship so that both countries grow without unhealthy competition or conflict. She noted that nations must deal with issues of economics and international politics in a way that is not win or lose, or what she called zero-sum. Secretary Clinton also said that both the United States and China have to meet responsibilities to their own citizens and the international community. The value of China's money, the yuan, was among the economic issues discussed at the meeting. In early May, the exchange rate was over 6 yuan to the American dollar. The United States says China intervenes in foreign currency markets to keep the exchange value of the yuan low. A lower value means Chinese exports are less costly than their competitors. Critics also say China unfairly supports its industries with many other forms of government support. Last year, America's trade deficit with China reached a record $295 billion. At the talks with American officials, Chinese Vice Premier Wang Qishan defended his country's money policy. He said China is moving at a measured rate to make its currency more flexible. And he urged the United States not to politicize economic issues. Mr. Wang also called on the United States to ease controls on high technology exports and increase Chinese access to financial markets. Secretary Geithner said China had moved toward a better way of valuing the yuan, but he said more reform was needed. He said a strong, more market-determined yuan will help strengthen China's economic reform goal of moving toward higher value-added production. Currency reform, said Mr. Geithner, also was important to China's financial system and to increasing consumer demand at home. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. You can find more news about economics at voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Last week, we told you about a recent talk in Washington on trade ties between the United States and China. Former Secretary of the Treasury Henry Paulson spoke with former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley. The two men talked about the recent slowdown in the Chinese economy and the need for more personal spending in China. They also discussed the need for China to reform its state-owned companies. These companies often operate with low-interest loans and a lot of help from the government. In July, President Obama said China was creating an unfair playing field in its car industry. That same month, the Obama administration requested talks or consultations at the World Trade Organization. The United States says China has unfairly placed more than $3 billion in taxes on imports of American-made cars. Officials say increasing the price of imports helps Chinese car makers. Mr. Paulson said Chinese government aid for state-owned companies, like oil companies and car makers, will end up hurting China's economy. Mr. Paulson said this: "The only way that the Chinese are going to be able to successfully make the transition that they're going to need to make to an economy that's much more efficient is by continuing to reform the state-owned enterprises." He said these state-owned companies need to compete fairly without all the subsidies and the special benefits. Chinese exports to the United States remain strong. Demand for Chinese goods rose more than 11% in June. And China says total trade so far this year is nearly $2 trillion. That is up 8%. China's strong imports have helped the country raise millions out of poverty. These gains were noted at human rights talks in July between the United States and China. But American officials say political reforms in China have been slow. The head of the American delegation, Assistant Secretary of State Michael Posner, noted China's economic gains. But he said political reforms in the country have not kept up with its economic changes. He said the human rights situation in China continues to get worse. Mr. Posner said, "Like people everywhere, Chinese people want to be treated with dignity. This means they seek economic opportunity and jobs. At the same time, they seek a lawful way to voice legitimate grievances and have a meaningful role in the political development of their own society." And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report. I'm Carolyn Presutti. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Last week, we told you about a recent talk in Washington on trade ties between the United States and China. Former Secretary of the Treasury Henry Paulson spoke with former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley. The two men talked about the recent slowdown in the Chinese economy and the need for more personal spending in China. They also discussed the need for China to reform its state-owned companies. These companies often operate with low-interest loans and a lot of help from the government. In July, President Obama said China was creating an unfair playing field in its car industry. That same month, the Obama administration requested talks or consultations at the World Trade Organization. The United States says China has unfairly placed more than $3 billion in taxes on imports of American-made cars. Officials say increasing the price of imports helps Chinese car makers. Mr. Paulson said Chinese government aid for state-owned companies, like oil companies and car makers, will end up hurting China's economy. Mr. Paulson said this: "The only way that the Chinese are going to be able to successfully make the transition that they're going to need to make to an economy that's much more efficient is by continuing to reform the state-owned enterprises." He said these state-owned companies need to compete fairly without all the subsidies and the special benefits. Chinese exports to the United States remain strong. Demand for Chinese goods rose more than 11% in June. And China says total trade so far this year is nearly $2 trillion. That is up 8%. China's strong imports have helped the country raise millions out of poverty. These gains were noted at human rights talks in July between the United States and China. But American officials say political reforms in China have been slow. The head of the American delegation, Assistant Secretary of State, Michael Posner, noted China's economic gains. But he said political reforms in the country have not kept up with its economic changes. He said the human rights situation in China continues to get worse. Mr. Posner said, "Like people everywhere, Chinese people want to be treated with dignity. This means they seek economic opportunity and jobs. At the same time, they seek a lawful way to voice legitimate grievances and have a meaningful role in the political development of their own society." And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report. I'm Carolyn Presutti. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. The job market is more competitive than ever for millions of workers around the world. In America, one reason for that right now is high unemployment after the worst recession since the 1930s. But other reasons involve changes in the needs of the American and global economies. In big developing economies like India and China, high turnover rates mean workers often move from job to job. These days, many job seekers go online to connect with employers. Job candidates want to show they have a lot to offer, but in many cases, they simply apply for a job title and list their work experience. Instead, they should describe the talents and abilities they could bring to an organization. That's the advice of Steve Langard, Director of Professional Opportunities at DePaul University in Indiana. He advises students on career planning and often talks about workplace issues in the media. He says social media sites are valuable when they show the abilities of job candidates and not just their job title and experience. He says, this really is a talent economy, and we're stuck with most job seekers presenting themselves in a job title mode. And I don't think it matches very well. Steve Langard also says employers should think harder about the skills they really need to help their organization reach its goals. Because at the end of the day, it's still about getting the right people in the right place at the right time and then keeping them. Ben Kirchner is the founder and chief executive of a media marketing company in New York called Elite SEM. SEM is search engine marketing. His company's job is to help businesses improve their websites and search engine results. Ben Kirchner says when his company is searching for candidates for new positions, it first looks within. It considers existing employees. After that, he says social sites can be valuable. 25% of new hires come from social media. 75% typically come from word of mouth. In other words, recommendations from other people. Elite SEM uses sites like Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn to learn about job candidates. LinkedIn is a networking site for professionals, so users might be more careful about what they say. But Mr. Kirchner says a site like Facebook can also provide a lot of information, good and bad, about a person. So pay attention to what you put on the internet and what others put online about you. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti. From VOA Learning English, this is Economics. Venezuela is facing a number of economic problems. Inflation is putting pressure on many businesses. Ratson Villaban owns a gift store, but his business needs American dollars to import products made in China. He is unable to exchange Venezuelan money for dollars at the official exchange rate of about 6.5 bolivares to the dollar. He says the supply of dollars is even limited on the black market, where dollars cost much more. He says that is why business at his store is down. Venezuela has the highest rate of inflation in South America. In February, Venezuela reduced the value of its currency by 1/3, which has made imports more costly. The economic troubles have resulted in shortages of products, from necessities like food to beauty products. Venezuela is a major oil exporter. The nation's oil wealth paid for many social programs during the 14-year rule of former President Hugo Chavez. But Venezuela's recent presidential election showed there are divisions in the country. Nicolás Maduro was declared the winner of a close election over opposition candidate Enrique Capriles on April 14th. Mr. Capriles disputed the vote and called for a recount. Enrique Capriles is a lawyer. He promised to open the economy to foreign investment. Nicolás Maduro is a former union leader. He served as vice president to Mr. Chavez before the president died of cancer last month. Mr. Maduro promised to continue the social policies and programs of Mr. Chavez. For supporters, the election was about saving programs for free housing, health care, and education. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. In August, Verizon and Google proposed a plan they say could keep the internet open while supporting investment in high-speed internet service. Verizon has the nation's biggest wireless network, while Google is the biggest internet search engine. The proposal was a surprise because the two companies have been on opposite sides of the debate over net neutrality. That is the idea that all content on the web should be treated equally. Internet service providers want to be able to charge more for heavy internet traffic or users who want special services. The Federal Communications Commission regulates telephone, cable, and satellite communications. But its power to regulate internet service has been questioned in the courts. The new proposal calls for rules barring service providers from preventing users from sending and receiving legal information of any kind. Users also could not be prevented from linking any application, service, or device they choose to the web. And broadband internet providers would be barred from discriminating against content and would have to be open about their policies. Supporters of net neutrality criticized the proposal for not including wireless providers. Wireless broadband is among the fastest growing parts of the internet. Others oppose the creation of a two-tiered system on the internet in which some content gets a fast lane and other content goes slowly. But Daniel Brenner says such a system already exists. Daniel Brenner is a partner at the law firm Hogan Lovells in Washington. He says service providers want to be able to charge more because they build networks out to their customers across the country. Such companies are the so-called last-mile providers. But the internet is really a network of networks, which exchange traffic all the time and compete with each other. And not all networks reach the last mile to a customer's door. Paul Karopas of Global Crossing says his company wants to make sure agreements between service providers are honored on all networks. That way, a service promised by Global Crossing on its fiber optic network will be extended all the way to a customer's door, even if another company carries the service that last mile. The Verizon-Google proposal offers suggestions for a debate that is not likely to end soon. Daniel Brenner says the FCC needs clearer guidelines from Congress. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report. From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report in Special English. 18 months of conflict in Syria have hurt the country's economy, but parts of the capital, Damascus, feel normal. Prices are higher, but goods are still available. A VOA reporter recently visited Damascus under the guidance of a Syrian government official. She told us that the spice market of Old Damascus is an unusual sight in a country affected by civil war. It is active. People are shopping there. This takes place while Syrian military forces strike nearby towns where rebels have support. One man she met operates a business once owned by his father and grandfather. He sells cumin, dried peppers, pine nuts, and almonds. He told VOA that business is about the same, but prices have gone up. This has affected both his customers and profit. He is thankful, though, that supplies are still arriving at his shop. But he says people are cutting back and mainly buying essential goods. A spokesperson with the Syrian Ministry of Economy and Trade says Western restrictions on Syria have caused problems. International sanctions came following the government's violent reaction to its opponents. But, he says, the government has worked to keep business in the capital thriving. He notes that there is a self-sufficiency to the Syrian economy and that it is very diverse. Syria is, however, seeking help from outside the country. Russia, China, and Venezuela are major trading partners. The spokesman says many of these countries stay focused on business interests and not political matters. But conditions in Syria are important to many other countries. Many thousands of people have been killed in violence across Syria. For VOA Learning English, I'm Alex Villarreal.